And as a place I spent a lot of my time in youth in around the Orange area of Maneldra, I love coming back to this part of the world. It's a great part of the world, and I really do enjoy it. It brings back a lot of memories each time I come back here. So, and I know the style of firefighting has a really strong historic background, pretty much from landowners doing what they do, and long before state intervention in anything, and the rural fire service we've heard of, people were dealing with fires and engaging with local aerial operators, and they just made things work. And I know that, and it should be acknowledged that things didn't start happening once the RFS started doing things, and I don't pretend that for a moment. I like to think that hopefully we add some value nowadays by providing the level of support that wasn't able to be provided support financially before. And I guess the things that Brett spoke and David spoke about the access to aviation and heavy plant and things like that to make your jobs a little easier is the types of things that I like to think that we've made a difference in. And of course, obviously, acknowledging the government current and the government of the day who made that funding available. I'll just run through some statistics as far as what happened on a statewide basis in this last fire season, and then obviously have some comments on it. So we had more than 6,000 wood bush and grass fires. And when I say 6,000, that's not mean there was more fires, but I mean ones that actually got to go on and actually did something. 1.4 million hectares burnt statewide, 80 Section 44 declarations, 33 incidents of emergency warning status. Now that's the things that Brett and David spoke about that came out of the Victorian fires, where we've got more formalised levels of warning now. Obviously, the fires being advised, watch and act, and emergency warning are those ones that are about to hit the community. And I think from a community point of view, what that allows us to do now is they can look at and say, what's the most important thing to us at that moment, if I'm in the vicinity of that fire, and it's the one that's got the emergency warning, because that's the one that's got the potential, based on the fire danger that was there and how close it is to homes, to destroy property. So I think it's worked well. But notwithstanding that, statewide we lost 62 homes in the fire season. 53 of those alone were in Coonabarabran. So obviously, whilst we can talk about the successes, it's obviously important to also acknowledge there is a cost. There's a cost, and I'll talk obviously a little bit about, apart from the homes, the livestock that was being lost, the fencing, the plant, the machinery. There was a lot of impact on rural communities and from fires in this last season. And so, whilst we can say how good it worked and we didn't lose any lives, and that is the most important thing, it's important not to overlook the impact onto landholders of these fires, and some of them will take some time to recover. And we spoke, and obviously we've already covered the fires locally that occurred, but it did start. I've got to say, the fire season started really in late July in the northern part of New South Wales. Traditionally, that does happen. The fire season did obviously a little bit early in some areas, but it did follow a typical pattern. What was I guess different was the concern we had of the fuel levels, particularly west of the ranges, on the back of those really wet seasons. So I'll just talk a little bit about that period between the 7th and 21st of January, which is where we had the peak of our activity. And it's just interesting, particularly when you talk about the things that were happening, when you look at it locally, the things Brett was talking about, how the communication worked and that. And I'd like to just give you some stats to just put you in the context of what was going on statewide. Now, some of it's a bit hard to see, I know that map, but all of those little dots are incidents that were going in those periods between the 7th and 21st of January. So you can see that there was clusters, but there was fires all over the place. There wasn't just fires in one area, it was pretty well busy statewide. The black areas are the bigger fires, and you can see those. And then the shaded red areas are areas that were in Section 44 declaration. Now, that could be preemptive or not. Most of them were genuine, but some were preemptive. I guess it just goes to show how big a portion of New South Wales is subject to that sort of threat. We had a forecast for the 8th of January, and that forecast was for some conditions, widespread, extreme, severe, but even catastrophic in some areas. Now, there was forecast of the worst weather that we've experienced in this state in records for some areas, particularly some areas that in quite populated areas, and I'll show you a map shortly. That caused us to have considerable concern, particularly when you were talking about areas like Illawarra, just south of Sydney into the Shoalhaven. You have got so much population there, a lot of bush, a lot of population, and so we had to do some significant things. And there's already some pre-formed things that occur on catastrophic days, and they're things you may not normally see because they happen as a routine now following the Victorian fires. But so we would, in discussions with police and the rest of the emergency management partners, all schools were contacted. Now, while schools weren't there, there was still some activities at schools. Schools weren't actually in normal school hours, but there was still a lot of activities going on in those schools. Things like closure of public places, things like that, that all happened in some of those areas. People were moved out of camping areas just simply because of the level of risk that were associated and how quick, if a fire were to start in some of those areas, how hard it would be to get people out. And I'll give you an example. Any of you know Kangaroo Valley type area, you have people camping in those areas, and now if a fire started there on that really bad day, there's just no way you could get people out. So the decision was made to say, no, we need to move these people out. So there's a lot of those sort of things going on. Preemptive Section 44 declarations, and proactive policing of high-risk areas. And what I mean there is, on those really bad days, we had RFS aircraft, police aircraft, basically patrolling known arson spots. Known arsonists were visited by police, and basically they knocked on their door and they said, we're watching you today, and we're going to be keeping a very close eye on what you're doing. And that sort of thing has a really big effect, because whilst arsonists might be stupid, they're not that dumb. They know that they're going to be, if a fire starts in their area, they know that they're going to be the #1 suspect. So luckily, we did have a lot of fires start, but luckily I think the arson activities were kept fairly minimal, and where they were occurring, there was quite a number of arrests. This is what the map looked like for the state on the 8th of January. And you can see you got very high is the yellow, severe is the orange, red is extreme, and then the darker striped thing is catastrophic. Now we had the adding of those riverina areas came on the next day, the revised forecasts, and that was added on as an afterthought, which is great because it puts us in it, because there's a lot of time it takes to get everything in place for dealing with that sort of catastrophic forecast. So that did provide some challenges, but luckily RFS districts just responded to that, and brigades responded, and it worked really, really well. So, but I've got to say, it was some pretty awful weather. On that one day, 186 incidents, 127 of those were bush and grass fires. And we had the ICON system, for those of you who know it, is the system we use for managing incidents statewide. It's the busiest ever day it's had. More than 1,000 people using that system at one time, which is a testament to the system that it held up so well, and it worked really well. Some records were broken, and you can see there the temperatures at different parts of the state in the ACT. Really, so I guess the thing is the predictions of the day certainly did manifest itself. It wasn't one of those days where they predict doom and gloom, and suddenly you wake up the next morning and it's pissing with rain or something. So which sometimes happen, but they didn't get it wrong. They got it exactly right. And then you go to something about some of the fires we did have in that period. So the 12th of January. Up in the Warrumbungle National Park, which the fire David spoke about in Barabran. And you can see there, this fire started in a national park. There was some efforts to suppress that fire, but it got away on that really, some really bad weather, and it ran and ran really hard. And you can see that the Siding Springs Observatory. Now that photo was taken from an aircraft as that fire was, as you can see, moving up that hill pretty quick. And at the time, and this is something that we've had some subsequent discussions, but we were told that fire crews, a local, the employees were there, had stayed in the facility. And to be honest, we were just looking at that thinking, holy crap, how the hell, we had some genuine concerns about it. So we sent some helicopters in some pretty atrocious conditions, and the pilots were really reluctant to do it, but we said that we were genuinely concerned. So we did get aircraft there, and they did do a fair bit of work trying to protect the main building, and we did find out later that the people had left. But later that night, fire crew from Fire Rescue went in there and babysat that building for the night, which obviously prevented any further loss from Ember attacking that. So anyway, luckily it worked out well, but that fire itself, we had 53 homes, a lot of outbuildings, and literally hundreds of kilometres of fencing, 847 head of sheep and 318 head of cattle that were lost in that fire. And that fire just was moved, and interestingly, Brett mentioned about the state operations doing the fire prediction modelling, and we obviously did that for this fire, but it did things that just were outside the models. It moved extremely quick, and I'll give you another shot of that. You can see that house there, and so you can see just how big that fire was and how quickly it's moving. And you've got to say, if you were there and you were looking at that house, you'd think, holy moly, they don't stand a chance. But there's the house standing after the fire. So they were pretty. It was pretty lucky, and not well, probably good work as well. And I guess the thing that is this is a photo of that same fire that was taken out of from an airline, and you can see that the plume is extremely big on that fire. And I think what that's demonstrating is that when you get those fires that get to such an intensity that they have that sort of level of plume, they become a plume-driven fire, and the weather is not necessarily the big driving force. It's the plume itself that's actually becoming it's a self-fulfilling type fire. So that's caused us to look at those types of fire. They're going to have to be a different category when you start talking about. And look, and it's funny because we know that inherently from those, from around the years of going to fires. You know, when you get to that, you think, gee whiz, it's making its own weather, it's doing all these things. But no one's ever actually said, what does that actually mean about the rate of spread and all the rest of it. So there's a bit of work to be done in trying to nut that sort of stuff out. But there is some work by researchers that's going to be done to look at that and work out what does that mean for the future. Because the important thing for us is to just make sure we provide, and I guess this comes back to what Brett's point was before about the staff here providing support to brigades and group officers in the field. From a state level, what we're trying to make sure we do is provide the same level of support that is being provided in the field to the local IMT here. So give them as much information as we possibly can, make sure aircraft and plans and that are available so they can deploy as locals need them, but also provide things like this modelling to say, listen, with these given situations, this is what this fire may do, and that may influence the priorities of what you do and where you put your resources locally. So, as I say, it's the same philosophy. Just some other statistics that are quite interesting in that period between 7th and 21st. So the total number of 000 calls for fire, 1,348. 512 bush and grass fires, and again, they're the significant type fires. 650,000 between that period. 8 days of total fire bans, 4 of those were statewide. We got a lot of criticism for the statewide because there was, I don't know, a sixth of the state that wasn't in that particular period. But the problem we had was we had so much commitment from resources and aircraft. What we were trying to do was stop new fires, of course. Hence why we went for a statewide total fire ban. Because I've got to say, I don't know why it is, but the northern part of this state, the landowners seem to be very different in their attitudes. You don't seem to find the same level of escape fires out here that you get up there. I know you do get them, but not to the extent you get in the northern part of the state. There's literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that occur each year up you know, in the northern part of the state. So I don't know whether it's something in the water or the attitude. I have no idea. But maybe we need to export some of you people up there to try and teach them how to.
Excuse me, is that on the coastal side or inland?
Mostly the coastal, but a little bit inland, but mostly coastal. It actually got to the point where we were having so many escape hazard reductions that we actually, the police sent a strike team. We sent some RFS fire investigators up, and then we issued, I think, as RFS we issued 53 fines up there, and police, I think, did something like 30 or 40 court attendance notices. And it's actually got to a point now where there's no more Mr. Nice Guy with these people. We're actually now, they're going to be fined, and if they do it again, they're going to be taken to court, because the amount of money that the state is investing and time, brigade members' time, in actually putting out fires, or you always have accidents, and everybody understands that, but when the same person does it year in, year out, a bit of slow learner, I think. Right.
Rob, I think it's worthwhile making a comment to this area here that you're talking about the subtropical area on the northeast corner of New South Wales, and it's traditional to burn off in the spring. These are the escapes. That's what Rob's talking about.
Yeah, it is. Now look, it's genuine stuff to do. No one's saying they shouldn't be burning, but what they need to be doing is doing it a bit safer. You know, not this, I'll just let it run and, I don't know, someone will stop it somewhere, or the weather will put it out one day. You know, and when you start getting in really, really dry conditions, and that might work in an average year, but what happens is when it's really dry, it doesn't go out. The wetland gullies aren't there, and these fires continue, and you end up expending a lot of time and resources putting them out. So there was 41 Section 44 declarations in that period, around 10,500 firefighters from all the agencies, 650 aircraft taskings. That's a lot of tasking. That's not individual assignments to fire. That's aircraft tasked to areas to do things. So that's huge. 88 deployments of remote area fire teams, and 450 pallets of foam and retardant and drinking water distributed around the state. Huge. So there's a huge amount of, I guess, things that go on to try and keep the machine, that's the RFS, ticking along in those sort of times. As we spoke about, in that period, 57 homes destroyed, 13,500 sheep, and almost 500 cattle. 1,700 kilometres of fencing, and 33,000 hectares of mixed pasture. And that's what I guess what I was talking about, the impact on some rural landholders. It's quite devastating, it really is. Luckily there's some good provisions to provide assistance to those people, but it's still, that will never fix what they've lost. And talking about inquiries, 3,000 metre inquiries in that same period of time. And 52 local government areas covered by natural disaster declarations. And importantly, as both David and Brett said, no lives were lost, which is something that's really good. And I would just say, though, in saying that, we ought not, and we don't, get complacent to think that doesn't mean it won't happen, because inevitably we will have some fires, and inevitably we will lose lives. So, whilst I think our performance has been really good, we ought not get to that point where we become complacent and think job's done, because it's never done, and we will ultimately lose lives again. The thing is to keep pushing ourselves to make sure we do as well as we possibly can, and after every fire have a good look at what we did and be honest enough to say what worked and what didn't work, and what didn't work then be obviously open enough and big enough to say, well, we didn't do that as well as we should, and let's try and do it better next time. And I think that goes back to the comments that David had about the Dubang experience, that, you know, we learnt a lot of things out of that as an industry. Certainly the RFS did, and I think National Park too. So, and I think that there's a lot of changes that happen in that, and that's through that whole process of just obviously understanding and being honest enough. This is another fire down at Shoalhaven on the 7th that happened. 9,500 hectares, no losses. And then looking at an information and warnings point of view, look at the RFS website. On that 2-week period, 8.7 views of a million views of the RFS website. I mean, that's a huge amount of people that are logging on. I guess this just goes to show how people get their information now has changed so rapidly. But that doesn't mean we abandon everything else we do. We still should keep up all the traditional methods that we do communicate, be it telephone, trees, email, whatever that is. That's all still good. Nothing gets replaced. But it's just showing how as generations change, how people are changing the way they get it. And on that one day, the really bad day, 2.7 million views of the RFS website. And if you think, and you would have heard during that period, the Victorian CFA website crashed. And I've got to say, we were pretty nervous with the number. We were starting to see how many people were logging on. We had Telstra sitting in head office, and they just kept throwing more and more bandwidth, onto it to try and make sure they didn't. And I've got to say, I could almost hear the website groan. I really could. It started to just go just a little slow, but it held up and it never fell over, which was really, really good. Twitter, 15.5 million impressions, and we were trending fourth globally, which, when you think about all the things that go on in the world at a given time, and Australia, being honest with ourselves, we're a pretty small player of the world, that's pretty amazing. The Bushfire Information Line, the 1-800 number, 26,000 calls. A lot of them were dealt with by the automated recordings, but 12,500 more than that were taken by operators. So we had a lot of people taking the calls, and on that one day, 2,800 calls. Emergency alert, which is that text-based alert system, and the thing where it rings your home and gives a message. 99 campaigns, 43 use the newer location-based alert. So that's basically the cell tower, and it broadcasts to any mobile on that cell tower. We learned some things. I'll tell you, one of the things, being honest, where we've got to be honest with ourselves, and where we had some unintended consequences. When we had the catastrophic forecast, the Illawarra, which has never had that before, we felt we needed to warn people what was coming. So we decided to send out emergency alert to the population that covered. What it resulted in one afternoon, and it didn't just last the afternoon, but we sent out on one day 784,000 text messages and 224,000 landlines. The problem is that started, I think we started at like about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. It finished about 3 or 4 in the morning. So people were asleep and they were getting these things in the middle of the night. And unfortunately what happened was some of the people, particularly some elderly people, they actually thought that they didn't, I guess, get the message properly, and they thought it meant that there was a fire there, and so it did cause some concerns there. And I guess we have to have a good look at the language we use in those messages to make sure that it's getting the right message across rather than unduly alarming people. So that's something we've learned out of that. The Fires Near Me application, for those of you that are tech savvy, 150,000 downloads of it, and used over 750,000 times in January. And then you can see on that one day, 12,000 downloads, 80,000 searches for a single fire in a single hour. So it's just amazing. 50,000 bushfire survival plans, and on the one day, 16.7. Talk about waiting till the horses bolt. Anyway, and the website is. There's another fire. That's up in the Hunter Valley, Aberdare. That was a fire, and you wouldn't. It wasn't a big fire. Well, it didn't end up being a big fire. 116 hectares, but I'll tell you, it moved pretty fast. And that's an interesting fire because it was quite an urban area. But day after the fire was basically all out, there was 2 fires in homes, and what it was embers that got into the roof cavity, and they sat there for more than a day, and then started fires. Another 24 hours later. So it's an interesting exercise. So every roof space had to be checked in those streets that adjoined that fire. So. That was quite an interesting one. Base camps. That's, I think, one of the things that work pretty well is being our ability to put base camps in, and the idea was that we've had numerous instances in past years where we've had fires in remote areas, and crews have had to drive, say, 3 hours to get to the fire from where they've been housed. Then they're going to drive another 3 hours back and do 12 hours on there. And there was an occasion where we had a firefighter, the driver fell asleep on a Cat 1, a truck full of people, and that truck ended up rolling. Luckily, all the people were okay, but it really was a big wake-up for us, and we said we just can't have these lengths of time that people are on the fire ground. So we've established the base camp program where we can house people, and it's got TVs and all that. I'm not sure whether everybody's been in the meeting, but the comments back from volunteers have been and has been very positive. So that's something we're going to continue to enhance. 131 building assessments. That's where a home's lost. We go in there and basically look at why did that home burn down, as in how did the fire enter the home, and that all goes back into the developments to make sure homes are built better in the future. 306 fires investigated. It's another fire down at Harden, grass fire. 14,000 hectares burnt, and in that one fire, more than 10,000 head of sheep were lost, and 170 head of cattle, and 3 outbuildings and farm equipment. And they were big outbuildings and a lot of machinery in those. It wasn't just a single old tractor, some old Massey Ferguson. We were talking pretty high-tech machinery that were lost. So that combined with the amount of head of stock that were lost is a huge impact on that community. Animal and agricultural services helped a lot of landowners and fodder drops and things like that, so that all sort of stuff kicked into gear. And I think that sort of whole of government approach seemed to work well in partnership with local councils. I think it worked well. Obviously if it didn't, we'd have heard pretty quick. Evacuation centres were opened, and things even like Barradine Hospital was evacuated, simply because things like power wasn't there, and they had to move it, and the exercise of those people being moved from there was quite amazing. Another fire, the Yarrabin fire in Cooma, that was 12,300 hectares. 3 homes were destroyed in that fire, 16 vehicles, water tanks, 2,500 head of sheep, 1 cow. Happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But more than 700 kilometres of fencing were lost. And so you see those that, the 3 homes, but collectively when you start adding up all the stock that were lost, and it's funny, in that Yarrabin fire I spoke about, there was some prime sheep breeding stock that were lost in that as well. Like that, and I'm talking about really, really top-notch. So it wasn't just the number of sheep that were lost, it was the quality of those sheep as well. So another fire, Harden Yass Valley, 1,600 hectares, and that burnt pretty close to a lot of properties, and there's some really, really good work to prevent any loss of properties there. So what worked? The coordinated firefighting arrangements between the different players in this state. I will put up against anything in this country, and I believe it works better than anything else that occurs in this country. No matter what other people do, I will absolutely stand by the arrangements. Everybody works really well. The RFS people, the fire rescue, state forests, national parks, all the other support agencies work brilliantly, and that's by having them all in the one central location as a head office, but also having them in the various IMTs where they're needed. The Bushfire Management Committee structure, the works that was spoken about earlier, them doing their work makes it, when we're doing their work properly, makes everything work so much better when you get really bad days in the fires. And just touching on something that David said, it was about the hazard reduction effectiveness. Absolutely makes a difference. If you can have the burns in there, it will help. It's not, we're not going to burn everywhere and stop every fire. Look at it here. Canopolis does a lot of burning. You still get fires, but by doing the burning, you make a difference. So it is important. And the use of aircraft, including the remote area fire teams and the new RART, which is the remote area response teams, which is where we have 4 crew of 4 in a helicopter on bad lightning days. They actually went to 65 fires where they started in lightning areas, very remote areas, and actually extinguished those fires that didn't get a hold. And those are the fires, those ones where they start in lightning on hills and you can't get to them straight away. They end up being really problem fires, particularly in that sort of weather conditions, so that worked out really well. Things like the Hotspots program has really seemed to make a difference, working with farmers and bringing the nature conservation together. That's all worked very well. I think the other thing that's talking about the use of aircraft, the first response and availability of aircraft, I've got to say one of the things that just does, and I've got to say, and I don't want to get into a whole bonfire about this, but it drove me insane when you looked at the effort that happened across this state, the work that brigades did that was supported by plant, supported by aircraft, and the results, and acknowledging the losses that were had, but considering how bad it would have been, and yet what we've had since that is just the people from the sidelines sniping about, why do you use this aircraft? You don't need it. I mean, I've had to be on bloody ABC radio and all this, arguing with some people, and you'll know who they are. You all know who they are. I'm not going to get into who they are, but you know who they are. Sitting there saying, we don't need aircraft. It's a waste of money. Government can save a lot of money, just don't give the aircraft. All you're going to do is just burn a bit more, and you wouldn't need any aircraft any time. And then I had another one of the people from that same group suggest that the whole Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury area could be taken care of if he was given a helicopter for a week and a drip torch. So that's the sort of people we're dealing with. And I guess the message to you, my message to you is that unless I'm completely misreading, you all seem to be quite embracing of the way that things were done here. The plant, the aircraft, the hazard reduction, and that's exactly the right, I think it's exactly the right mixture. And it works well. And if we get to a situation where Canobolas is one of the best performing districts in this state, still think that you still need aircraft, you still need them on call, and you still need to plan, because you're always going to have fires, then what I would say to you is that please express your opinion, because all we hear is the vocal minorities that knock it and suggest that we're not doing the right thing by providing those aircraft. So if that's what you believe, then I would ask that you please also communicate that as well. And just don't let the vocal minority be the ones that are heard, because I don't believe that that's the case at all. But anyway, I don't want to carry on too much about that. I think some of the challenges we have for the future are going to be about, and David touched on a little bit, and which made me think to raise it, is about the new generation risk plans and that. And we do have to move to a new generation plan, which is basically looking at the bushfire risk and the structural risk as well, because we have obviously responsibilities in that, and coming out with a single model, which then is matched to a resource allocation model. And I hope that and we're doing some work with Fire Rescue to try and get one that both organisations use, and we all use the same thing. So there's some good work going on like that, and I'm hopeful that that's going to actually work. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning is some of the challenges we have going ahead is, some of rural New South Wales is dying. Some of the towns are just not going to have the people in them anymore. People are leaving because of work, and what used to be a particular town supported by a particular industry isn't there anymore. And that's providing a huge challenge for us, because what you've got small towns. Might have been 5,000 people originally, but it's now reduced down to might not even have 1,500 people, might have 1,000 people, and you've got a retained fire brigade station, you've got an RFS brigade, you've got an SES, and you're looking at it and saying, well, we're not all going to be able to do this. It can't work. We can't keep having that, because we're all competing. There's a finite number of people in that town available to do or willing to do that work. So it's no good if it's all sitting there competing. So there is a lot of discussion going on about trying to make sure that we come up with something different, and I don't know what that is, to be quite honest, to say we need to look at that, and we need to work a bit better, and certainly government has an expectation, as right they should, to say you guys need to talk about this sort of stuff and make sure that we're doing this sustainably. And I've got to say, what we're doing right now is probably not sustainable in those little town areas. The rural areas surrounding is not an issue, because that's pretty well RFS. There's no one else there, and so we're not competing with anyone. but you've got to try and make sure we work out what we do in those towns. And as I say, I don't have the solution, but I know that we're doing a lot of discussions between agencies. And the good thing is that we've never worked as closely as we are now, which is really good. And some of the other challenges we're obviously is there's no doubt that the current government has inherited a difficult budgetary position, and all agencies are having to make some cuts in staffing and make sure that the money we have we're using as well as we can. So we're doing a lot of work, and that probably comes back to that last point a little bit, because every agency needs to make sure it's doing that. So I think that I think that was a point David made in his presentation about doing more with less, and that doesn't mean less as in less trucks and things like. We're not talking about that. There's no suggestion that you people aren't going to get the trucks, or we're going to go to brigades and say your truck's not there, going to be funded anymore. It's not about that. It's about trying to make sure we, I guess, use what we have as good as we can, and in some cases maybe doing more. And and also providing value adding to our communities. I mean, I'm probably running over a bit of time, am I, David? But that's okay, isn't it? I won't go on to this one, but some of the things, and I'll just give you an example, is things like community first responder. We've now got that in place in a few areas in the state, and that's not taking over from the ambulance service or anything like that, but it's facing the reality that there's places in New South Wales where it will take more than an hour to get an ambulance there. So if we think about that, and it's a lot of it is our own communities and our own brigade members that could be having a heart attack, could be doing something, and if we have the ability to provide and help those people and just sustain life until an ambulance gets there to take over that treatment, shouldn't we think about trying to do that? We've got defibrillators on every one of our vehicles, and I've got to say, if it was my family member, I'll tell you, I'd be using it. I don't care what anybody says, and that's what you're going to do. And I guess all I'm saying is these are your communities, and you need to think about what's the need of those communities. And those defibrillators were put in place for brigade members because heart attack's one of our biggest killer, and none of us are getting any younger. But the fact is, we've got family members and our fellow community members that we also need to think of. So I'll just leave you with those thoughts to think about how that sort of value adding, and what else can we do to help our community, because at the end of the day we need to just try and make sure we keep pushing ourselves forward. I won't talk any longer. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I feel very privileged to be here. I know that you're not people just to sit there and listen to someone crap on. I know that you're practical people, so thank you very much for indulging me. Appreciate it.